spiritual path or some type of higher purpose to one's life. Spirituality and religion, as you all know, are very different. So religion prescribes a path to attaining special insights, knowledge, or access to higher realms. And they're generally constructed the same way, where you have a large number of believers at the bottom and a specialist class of priests who are above them. And aside from that structure, religions, they differ in many ways on their nomenclature, on how they pronounce the names of their gods, but they all serve the essential same functions. And people join religions for the same reasons. But it's important to note that not all religions are spiritually oriented. You have political religions like communism, which represents a form of state-olatry, worship of the state instead of a named deity. And when we say worship, what do we mean by worship? So I use the word to refer to the act of acknowledging or genuflecting or praising a power that one considers to be higher than oneself. And this can take many forms, but it generally is a form of self-abasement relative to something higher or better. We're not worthy. You grovel on the floor. Now, people who favor statist governments and those who don't are obliged to render to government what is government's. In other words, like whether or not you like government, you're paying taxes. And taxing and tithing are supposed to be two different things. Tithing is when you voluntarily give a certain amount, like with the Mormons, it might be 10% to a church. So these are two different things, one of them being, of course, voluntary. But what I'm suggesting here is that is taxing, this compulsory tithing, any more or less valid than this? Is it any different than taxation? Or taxation and tithing, two of the same? And given that government has essentially supplanted religion, I'm making the case that yes, they are. And one of the reasons why this is a problem is that they're legislating their religion in the form of this mandatory doomsday you're all expected to adhere to or believe in. And even if you don't believe in it, even if you doubt it, and I'm talking about climate change, global warming, even if you think it's fake, you're still paying for it. I mean, even in the town where I live, they just banned plastic bags, and so people are stuffing their pockets with groceries because we weren't given a warning. And this is all predicated on the idea that they're saving the planet. So you wouldn't tolerate this from a religion. If some religious group came through town and they said, we want everyone to, cover up their hair or something, something that affects everybody universally, you would say, well, who are you to dictate? So one of the main points of this presentation is that this worldwide cult can masquerade as anything, even secularism. And it is essentially a form of religious mind control. And by religion, it's regimented worldview. It's about conforming you to a worldview. And the separation of church and state doesn't even exist to the extent that the church of state has really just been rebranded, or rather recreated in the form of mainstream media. So you don't think we have a state church? They're not legislating religion? Well, they are, because they're masquerading as science. So one of the things I'm pointing out today is that the world religion is heliocentrism, and that it's a blend of Roman polytheism and science fiction nomenclature, and then some. Every major aspect and component of Roman polytheism has been re-envisioned and adapted for the space age. And so even if you don't know that there is an esoteric side to the space program, even if you don't know that there's an esoteric side to what we're told is science and a scientific worldview, even if you don't know that there's this mystical side to it, you're still a part of its church, and you're praising its priesthood nonetheless. What's more, the idea of doomsday itself, the idea of revelations suggesting a future tribulation, that's a reinterpretation of Revelations. And that was a later modification, and that was done by the Jesuits. It is actually called Jesuit futurism. And Jesuit futurism is how post-Reformation, the Jesuit church realized, okay, we can scare people into coming back in the church by saying, hey, God's going to come back and punish those who have strayed from the church. We have the name of the actual Jesuit monk, the theologian rather, Francisco Ribera, joined the Society of Jesus in 1570. Now, these dates, whether you trust the official historical accounts or not, that's not the important thing. The main thing is this. What he did was introduced futurism. This was the proposal that revelations wasn't something that referred to the past, but rather the future, a second coming. He introduced this whole idea and proposed that revelations refers to this time that's about to be revealed, that it's something to fear in the future. So the idea of fearing a future calamity was injected later, and that's because, of course, people were straying, people were leaving, and so this was meant to reconsolidate that group of stray sheep. So this concept of doomsday and this concept of the wrath of God has been re-envisioned today with global warming, climate chaos. Wrath of God has become the wrath of globe. And even today, the Pope has introduced eco sins or ecological sins, where now if you are littering or you're sinning against the environment, well, now you're actually sinning against God. And this was recognized earlier this year. Ecological sins, Pope Francis's notion of let's make this a category in the official Catholic catechism. So here we go. This is from christianpost.com. Pope Francis' anti-biblical, anti-scientific notion of ecological sin. He says we have to introduce in the catechism of the Catholic Church the sin against ecology, the sin against our common home, because it's a duty. So this, even though it looks like he's just engaging in some kind of use of secularism. This is just science. Maybe it's a leftist move to justify leftist policies about global warming. But I'm saying no. This is actually part of this Jesuit futurism, in that sin has been replaced with this concept of pollution. Original sin has been replaced with your carbon footprint. Every single living being takes a toll on Mother Earth, according to this line of thinking. So we're at a time where now we're modern, so we don't believe in original sin. Now we don't believe in sin. We're moral relativists. Well, how do you get moral relativists to believe in sin? You use science, the religion of the day, and they've done it. And even the Pope agrees. So again, they've re-envisioned the concept of sin, which angers God and triggers his wrath, with pollution. Well, what does pollution do? It heats up the world, angers the globe. And of course, if you're born with original sin, you have to work your entire life and be really good to make it to heaven. If you're born with a carbon footprint, you got to recycle and try not to eat meat and try not to eat dairy and try to reduce your impact so you can be worthy of, so we can collectively be worthy of the new heaven. And that's the next aspect to this that we're getting into today as well, is how they've redefined this old concept of heaven and the purity required for the individual to attain this heaven with this scientific paradigm and going green. And how going green and going sustainable has really the same connotations as purifying yourself of sin, recognizing your sin by confessing them, or recycling. See, when you recycle, you're separating your sins. You're recognizing these ones are bad, these ones are okay for the environment. These ones need to be recycled. And you take it to the bin with the hexagram and the 3 arrows. That's the green symbol because it's the green God. And we'll get into that as well, the God of recycling, how they've repackaged so much of the mystery religions for the modern day. Commenter says, exactly, ritual execration, being good all the time to get to heaven, heretics must be destroyed. And this heretics must be destroyed part of it makes it makes an appearance today where they're branding people as conspiracy theorists or denialists, deniers. Like, wait a minute, you're a denier if you don't believe in something that you can't see, but they say is real. And this is a form of pressure to believe in it based on consensus and based on the experts. It's no different than fundamentalists in a religion saying, well, our priests say this, and they're the ones who went to seminary school and they can read the books and they know that God intends this. They make these arguments from authority. Commenter says, in the Mormonism, you go to the telestial kingdom. Yeah, we're going to be going over the various ways they've repackaged these old concepts of heaven, where I believe now that space travel is allegory for states of higher consciousness, that it's all just allegory for a mystic vision or mystic travel. Just as building cathedrals is allegory for developing oneself in the Masonic lodge. You know, they use these allegories, and cathedral building or stonemasons, that idea of building a temple became an allegory for building a better world. And in many ways, the space program is no different. And we'll get into that as well. So the deniers of God's wrath, the non-believers, are considered threats to the survival of the planet and the human race. And so that's a dead giveaway. The rhetoric of the believer deriding you as a denier, it's like calling you an infidel. And just to clarify the point, a reality denier denies reality, but a non-believer in something that is not self-evident is just skeptic. A skeptic. You're not a denialist, you're a skeptic. There's a big difference. It's about burden of proof. So the believer in the wrath of globe is actually augmenting reality. They're imposing a belief onto what they see. So the person who is bringing the augmentation, the person who's making the extraordinary claim, and it's extraordinary because it's not obvious to you, you can't see it, it's out of the ordinary. They're the ones who have to bring the burden of proof. And what is their proof? Arguments from authority. And religions all make bold claims in the face of contrary evidence. They all do it. So is being a non-believer such a bad thing? And one of my points here is no. But the trouble is that today they've managed to make it so that not believing the mainstream news makes you a bad person, a terrorist, a conspiracy theorist, a moron. I mean, they have so many different ways of attacking you, impugning your intellect because you don't believe it, or accusing you of being a mischief maker, a troublemaker, a hater, because you're questioning the narratives at a deep level, maybe even calling it fake. They're censoring people left and right. I mean, we're all seeing it. Well, we're being censored to preserve the integrity of the church of state and its myths, its foundational myths. That's what it comes down to. I mean, in many ways, this is a new reformation, and the attempts that are being made to purge the internet right now represents the counter reformation or another one. So we let the religion into our minds. We're all churchgoers to the extent that we do not refute the claims that come out of the mainstream media. And when I say mainstream media, we have to include the big picture. When I say mainstream, I'm talking about the dominant. So it doesn't have to be any specific outlet. You know, we use this acronym here, GAME, or the GAME programmers working in unison. And GAME is the interlocking agendas and the shared backstage between government, academia, media, entertainment. So if you take these various areas, you know, government, your universities, your public education, private education, take the media outlets and then the culture industry, the movies, the music, all taken together. That's what they are using to construct your worldview. It's not just out of the news programming. So if you don't watch the news, you're still getting your programming. And we'll go into that. How even if you don't go to church, even if you don't consciously make any efforts to acknowledge their ceremonies, to acknowledge the one world order's religion, you're still practicing it. For example, Super Bowl Sunday is coming up on February 2nd. So let's go to that really quick. maybe it's not February 2nd this year, but it's, generally the first Sunday. Let's see here. Sunday. Okay, this time it's Saturday. So Saturday, February the 1st is Bridget's Day. It's a Gaelic traditional festival. It's the beginning of spring. And basically, this is observed as a way of acknowledging that, the spring is returned. The sun god is done weaning off of the goddess. So the meaning here behind the Super Bowl ceremony, in that it takes place on this ceremony, is that it's a green field. So it's a celebration of the spring already. But I found this really interesting piece here where, they're estimating 130 million people were watching the Super Bowl that year when Janet Jackson appeared on the stage with that bizarre wardrobe where her chest piece fell off. So listen to this. Super Bowl Sunday, February 1st, was the traditional pagan holiday of Obelisk or Candlemas. It involved calling for a young woman to parade around town naked, invoking the spirit of the pagan saint Brie, or it's spelled Bridget or pronounced Brie, in order to bring lactation in farm animals. So one of the characteristics of the goddess, of course, was that she would be, or the woman representing the goddess, is that she would be dark-skinned to represent being sun-kissed. And then she would be accompanied by someone representing the Sun King. So here you have, and I'll bring a picture for you, Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake. So he would be blonde, a perfect representation in this symbolic system of a sun god. And here she is representing Brie, the goddess. Now, this is, again, a fertility rite. So she's going through the green pastures, the green fields, or here, the Super Bowl field, and again, bringing lactation to farm animals. So she's the goddess of the spring represented by the sun, and you see a bare-breasted Janet Jackson with a sun ornament piercing her nipple. So the public outcry was really focused on, she showed her, she went bare-chested in public. And it was just a wardrobe flaw. How could they have let this happen? No, this was not an accident. This was meant to come off. This is done on this holiday. And this was Super Bowl 38 halftime show in Reliant Stadium, Houston, Texas. So the public, 130 million people or so watching this event, think, oh, this was just a publicity stunt. This was just an error. It's a tragedy. Oh, what a shock. Fall on your fainting couch, clutch your pearls. But, in reality, no, this was a celebration of the goddess Brie, and of course, the sun god who is now weaned. And of course, this ceremony also, and we'll go into that a little bit more right now because it ties into this Super Bowl coming up. So it's a little too simplistic to say that it's a satanic ritual. Candlemas, also known as the Feast of the Presentation of Jesus Christ or the Feast of the Purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary, so many different names and different ways that it's celebrated, but it contains the same basic rites, and it really does mean the same thing, even if it's very much occulted. So in some cases, this is the time when the sun is reaching through the south-facing doors, which represents the goddess, and the church is her womb, and the sun reaches the altar. The sun's light, the rays of the sun. And this is, again, a fertility rite. The rays of the sun represents the seed. The altar, the communion, of course, is, which we'll get into today, is a fertility rite. Yes, the Catholic Church is actually practicing fertility rites. And I'll show you how I learned about this, but how this is just so occulted you wouldn't see it. It looks very pious, everybody's very much covered, but it's very much disguised, just like how many people watching Janet Jackson having her shirt ripped off actually knew what they were seeing. Wade says, Super Bowl ceremonies are totally riddled with occult ritual, including young maidens calling forth the spirit as cheerleaders. Exactly. A couple of years ago, one of the Super Bowl Sunday halftime shows was marked by a power outage where it went dark for 33 minutes. So what do you think that means? Well, in the Masonic system, the people who aren't in the temple are in the dark. They exist in ignorance. The people who aren't in the lodge when it's closed, they're in the world, the wilderness. They wander in the darkness. And of course, they're symbolized by having blindfolds placed over their eyes or hoodwinked. So the masses are in the dark, and the people who know the truth, they're the initiates. And of course, at the Super Bowl Sunday, the people who were not in the dark were the initiates. They're the ones on the inside who put the people in the stadium into that condition. Kind of a, if you think about it, it's kind of a psychotic thing where they're weaponizing ignorance, intentionally keeping people ignorant. Okay, so let's continue. My point was, even if you're not consciously a part of the state church, even if you don't think you have a religion, even if you don't think that this dominant religion, NASA's cult, or the cult of the obelisk, and NASA is just one aspect of it, it's high priesthood, but the secret religion of the elite is practiced by anybody who's just blindly conforming to the MSM. It's the cultural default. The state's regimented worldview, its religion, its miracles, its fake science, its fake news, all of it is intended to shape how you see the world, to shape your values, and to coerce you into going where they want you to go next. And the next place where the public is being led is this idea of space colonization and the space age. And that's where we're going to be discussing the new heaven. And that's what they're offering. It's a utopian promise that heaven will eventually be achieved here and now on earth, but they can't complete it until everyone conforms. The vision will not be complete until it's uniform and it's universal. No souls left behind. Catholic means universal. And we do have a universal religion, and that's what the space program is. And that's one of the points that I'm making here, is that the one world religion isn't going to be the papacy and the Jesuits taking over and now everybody's Catholic, or it's not going to be a caliphate and everybody gets converted to Islam. It's not going to be Lucifer coming down on a flying saucer and converting everybody to New Age and everybody practices the secret. No, the one world religion's already here. It's the dominant worldview, and that includes the shape of the world. That includes the historical accounts that bolster the claims of the priesthood today. I mean, look, how much of what we believe is based on scientific, quote, findings of the past? You know, we live on an edifice of lies, and that's what we're going to be going into. So convert or kill is the usual manner by which these monotheistic cults operate. It's, you know, convert or kill, or rather, it's separating people by believers and non-believers, and then insulating the believers from the non-believers by demonizing those who don't fit into the cult. And we see this today. It's happening in the world through political correctness. So let's go ahead and start at the beginning. Let's start with Noah's Ark. So the space program, both public and private, is not a scientific endeavor. At its core, it's a syncretic adaptation of the ancient mystery cults and their ritual reenactment and dramatization of the cycles of reproduction and death. And these are bold claims, but we're going to break it down into its component parts. So first, we have to acknowledge the concept of religious syncretism, which is when two or more religious beliefs are blended into a new system. Kind of like how voodoo got added on to Catholic saints in some parts of the world where they were forbidden from practicing their old religion, what they called voodoo, or whatever name you call it by. These Afro-Caribbean religions have actually successfully managed to preserve, you know, these traditional beliefs when they were converted to Catholicism by grafting their gods onto these new gods they were supposed to accept. So, for example, Chongo, the god of thunder, becomes Santa Barbara. Or the various goddesses can be worshipped in the figure of Virgin Mary. And there are other counterparts to these various deities, the correspondences go pretty deep, and they find so many parallels that they're able to, successfully not change too much, but merge the two. So the idea is the ancient mystery cults are still the center of all the major world's religions. And what they have done is they have just blended these things together. So starting with this here, we have Noah's Ark. And you know the story. It has to do with the flood in Genesis, where God spared Noah, his family, and samples of all the different animals. So they were spared the flood. Now, the story of the flood here is pretty simple, that God is going to punish the world for its wickedness. Noah builds the flood to escape it. Now, there are many different flood myths like this. These are common things. The word ark in modern English comes from an Old English term meaning chest or a box, and that point's going to come up later, as there was a box placed in the back of the Tesla Roadster they sent to Mars, which they called an ark. Now, here is an example of how they've taken this concept of Noah and the flood myth, and the guy warning everybody about the myth and the coming flood, as a punishment from above for the wickedness. The symbol of Noah, aside from the ark, he's also recognized by a symbol of the dove. And the reason why, of course, is that after the flood was over, God sent him a symbol, and it was a symbol of hope, and it was a rainbow, and then there's a dove that comes along and has a branch in its mouth. And the branch in its mouth is telling him, hey, look, there's land. It's safe to come back. So this is a symbol of Noah. There's his ark, there's the dove, and there's the branch. And here you have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Again, this is NOAA, an organization that works hand in glove with NASA to warn us about global warming, the ocean levels rising. NASA and NOAA to announce 2019 global temperatures. They're giving their assessment of the major trends. And they're constantly warning us that because of our treatment of the environment, we are going to be dealing with a catastrophic flood. Now, the fact that they use the same symbol is very relevant here. Here you have their symbol. It is a dove flying over the ocean. And the name, of course, phonetically identical, not a coincidence. And the message is the same. And as I said earlier, it's all about that Jesuit futurism. Your original sin collectively, if you don't change your ways, if you don't change human nature, will trigger this response, will trigger this cosmic retribution. Same story. So you can be an atheist. You may laugh at the story of Noah, Noah's flood, and the ark, yet you've been given a modern counterpart. So then we look at some of these various vehicles, the SpaceX, these large rockets that they're building, which are essentially being described as arks to Mars to preserve civilization in the event of a worldwide catastrophe, which, of course, Noah is warning us about. Now, the people who adapt and conform and believe what they see on TV, they will not question the wrath of God. They will not question climate change. They are believers rather than deniers. They're the ones who are going to buy their tickets on the starship to escape when this place is judged. And what happens to the non-believers? And as you can see, the non-believers, the ones who don't go, if the scientists are right, will be the ones to suffer the flood. So government today has merged with religion via this eschatology, via global warming, climate change, apocalypse scenarios. The modern day fire and brimstone narratives, and that's what they are. These are fire and brimstone narratives. I mean, you got the floods, but then you also have the asteroids coming from the same sources. All of the doom the doomsaying, all the doomsday predictions are coming from the scientists. That should tell you something. It's not coming from the priests anymore. They get laughed at when they say it. So the government has merged with eschatology, which is the study of the end of things, because it's to give them power over you. So just as with the Reformation, you had the Counter-Reformation. People are leaving the church. How do we scare them back in? Jesuit futurism. Scare them about the end of the world, and they run back in. And then, of course, you tell the believers, don't trust the ones who left because they're going to bring about God's wrath. Well, what do you have today? You have the believers and the non-believers. And the non-believers are being censored. They're being called denialists. They're being described as reckless and dangerous because this dangerous misinformation will cause people to underreact, and therefore we will all suffer the wrath of globe. The only people who really believe that the world's going to end in the next few years are the true believers in what Noah has to say. So the believers in Noah today and the coming flood for the punishment of wickedness, i.e. pollution, are the atheists. That's proof right there that they have taken the old religion, the old worldview, these archaic views, and they've repackaged them. The space program now is a series of claims, myths, and stories that are falsely presented as scientific. And this worldview converts the people of the world into paganism under the guise of teaching them about the universe. Now, I'm not saying that paganism necessarily is a bad thing. What I'm saying is we are being converted into a worldview that we don't even know is a religious view, that it's not exactly scientific, it's not exactly objective, but it's arrived at through dogma, conformity, and faith. And of course, the people who do not conform, the people who do not have faith and who reject the dogmas are being marginalized on purpose, really, because if you sow any seeds of doubt, you take away the fear, you take away the need for the priests who are the only ones who can save you from the fear. And that's the main thing here. The priesthood positions itself as your savior. So let's take a look at the architecture of the world's biggest religion and how we have all been deceived into worshiping at its altar. Looking at the various components. Okay, so let's start with this. The concept of angels. Angels spy on God's behalf. You can't see them, but they can see you. To your knowledge, you've only seen them in pictures, in religious art. The only angels you've ever seen are statues, they're in books, or hearsay, maybe testimony. And again, they're God's spies. So you may think you're getting away with something, but they can see you, even though you can't see them. God's angels make sure that, when you go to confession, well, there's no use holding back because everything has been witnessed and it gets reported to God, the central authority. Well, what do satellites do? The satellite is a ubiquitous spy. You don't see these satellites. You can't. Some people claim they have, but we know that these are all drawings. This is artistic renderings. This is religious art. So we're examining the iconography of the satellite, these invisible spies that report to who? It's a government, central authority, the new God. And what are these satellites being used for? Well, primarily it's weather satellites telling us about the consequences of your sin, your pollution, our pollution, what we're doing to the earth. They're reporting back. They're reporting back to our priesthood. Hey, look, globe's not very happy with you believers. Globe's getting hotter because of your pollution. It's not a coincidence that these satellites generally look like angels, as in just these winged beings flying above who are bathing the light of the sun. You can't see them, they can say you. There's this element of faith here. Do you actually believe that you have these flying cameras with solar panel wings way up there that can see you, that can read your driver's license, that know what you're doing? Like, do you actually think that's true? Well, if you do, you are engaging in a little bit of, we'll say faith. You took an argument from authority or you trusted somebody, but somewhere along the line, You had to accept it without actually having seen one. All we have are artistic renderings. And we talked about Noah's Ark, which is to save the world from God's flood. And of course, the dove comes along just to say, and I think it was an olive leaf, just to know that the waters had receded. So these are elements that have been replaced pretty obviously. Now heaven, outer space itself, this is a concept which has been repackaged for the modern age. And the only people who've ever been to heaven, the only ones who've actually seen it are the saints. The ones who have gone up there, they know what it looks like, and they can tell you it's magnificent. God resides in the heavens, as do the high priests, whether it's through bodily ascension or spiritual transcendence. So the priests are in contact with God. They're like his intercessors between us and him. So we have to go through these living priests. So they are in a position to warn us about God's wrath. And they are always telling us to become conscious of our sin so we can have a better relationship with Globe. That's pretty much it. The astronauts are saying, from up there, they can see the damage that we're doing. So we have to really consider our actions. This is exactly how they're, like what I said of the eco sins, this is exactly how they're getting people to consider their actions affecting the whole. Only it's on the idea that you're saving the planet or you're staving the wrath of the planet. It's the same exact thing as trying to right yourself with God and get society to right itself. So you do have these new priests. These are the astronauts. And even when you listen to the astronauts, some will say that space is this infinitely black, peaceful abyss. Others will say that it's got a lot of colors. There's no real clear explanation what it looks like, and they don't show us pictures, and that's on purpose. I mean, we get some pictures, but we get these artistic renderings, but for the most part, we have to rely on them to tell us how great it actually is. Now, there's this thing called the overview effect that the astronauts are said to experience. And they say that when they get high enough and they can see the world in its entirety, they no longer see national boundaries. They no longer see politics as usual or race or any of the above. That the overview effect changes them. It's a cognitive shift in awareness. So from their point of view, now they no longer hang on to small-minded things like national boundaries, war. So the overview effect is defined as a cognitive shift in the awareness reported by astronauts while viewing Earth from outer space. It is experience of seeing firsthand the reality of Earth and space, which is now understood to be a tiny, fragile ball of life hanging in a void, shielded by a paper-thin atmosphere. From space, the national boundaries vanish, the conflicts that divide people become less important, and the need to create a planetary society with the united will to protect the pale blue dot becomes imperative. So you become a one-worlder. The instant you see it, you become convinced that we need to have a single unifying vision and we have to share in it so that we don't destroy this thing. And it basically means green. It means sustainable. This term was coined in 1987, the Overview Effect, Space Exploration and Human Evolution by Frank White. In 2018, the Space Buzz Project was created so children around the world can experience the overview effect. They aim to give children an effect like it using virtual reality. So what they want to do is they want to put kids in a simulation so they can have a virtual experience of seeing Earth from space. It's called the Overview Effect Foundation. So this claim here is that these astronauts now have some insight that you don't. They've risen above the world. They've risen above sin. I mean, look, this is literally what it means. It's esoteric. I mean, they didn't actually travel to space. This is all allegory. And again, they're in a unique position to warn us about the consequences of disobeying the globe. I mean, anytime you look at the space station in the news and the astronauts up there, they describe how the Earth looks from up there, and they're constantly warning us about it. So they're in a position to warn us not only about the condition of the planet, but also about asteroids, about other threats they can mitigate for us. So let's get into the next major symbol here, which would be the obelisk. So the rocket which takes you to the higher realms, that takes you to the heavens, is just a repurposed obelisk. They threw some fins on there, but it's the same thing and it means the same thing. So what you have here is a way to travel to the heavenly realm, and this is the symbol of the immortal god of regeneration, the vegetation deity. Obelisk worship is the principal business of the astronauts who travel the astral realms within their obelisk-shaped rocket ship. So the symbol is pretty simple. We hear about, Mother Earth, this way of characterizing the globe or whatever, but no, in truth, it's Father Earth, Mother Sky. So the Father Earth is dead. He dies, because he's the sun god, is pretty much the earth god. And we'll go into how this works. It's basically like this. The sun god dies and they reassemble him in his grave, but his member has been chopped off. And so they put an obelisk there to integrate him into one whole being. And then during the night, he has a conjugal visit with the goddess of the night sky, during which he reconceives himself. So he recycles himself, and then he's born again as the rising sun. That's the central myth. That's the meaning of the obelisk. And so when you're watching these rocket launches, that's the central myth that's being replayed. This is the Holy Communion to the Catholics, or the Great Rite to the New Agers. And it's the ceremonial dramatization of the sex act. And it's based on an anthropomorphized explanation for the rising and setting of the sun. So the mysteries of life and death and reincarnation are performed under the guise of this mystic rite. These are performed in the churches, and it's performed as rocket science in these modern rituals of the state church. So you have here where ancient mystery religion meets modern science. The sun rises in the morning as Horus, and Horus is the Egyptian name of the sun god, the child, often symbolized by the falcon. Now this is significant here because the god of the new age, and I'll show you how we know that this is their new god. This is the god of the new age, Horus, synonymous with the planet Mars. And of course, he's a falcon. And this is the reason why you have the Falcon 9 rocket with SpaceX. And as I'm talking about the rockets going into the sky as part of this symbolic conjugal visit between the Earth God and the Sky Goddess, you could also describe that as space sex, which is what SpaceX really means. So if we look at the SpaceX rocket with the Falcon 9, this whole allegory becomes very clear. Falcon 9 is just another reference to the god Horus, the Falcon god, the age of Mars. And where's Falcon 9 going? It's all going to Mars. So the term SpaceX and SpaceX is very significant here. It's not a coincidence. And this ties into the New Age movement as codified by Aleister Crowley in his Book of the Law, where they describe exactly why they're transitioning into this worship of Mars. Okay, so basically the sun rises in the morning. This is the God being born, the child of darkness. You often see the images of the goddess holding the child, or Isis holding her son, Horus. And what you're really seeing here is a symbol. You see, she's wearing the blue robes with the stars. That's how you generally see her represented. And she's holding the child. Well, that represents the newborn sun, or the sun rising. And of course, they called Horus the child of darkness because he's arriving out of the dark, from the east. So in the Egyptian version, the sky goddess, and this is in Thelema, this is how they represent her, is arched over the earth. And as we'll get into this, Aleister Crowley writes about this endlessly, about this union between the god on the ground and the goddess, and rising on the plains. And it's pretty much, as you'll see, a blueprint for how these rocket launches are portrayed, because it's all ceremonial. We're talking about a ceremony. So as the day ages, as the day goes on, the sun god, of course, is dying, hour by hour. This represents his dismemberment. He's being slain by the Prince of Darkness. And so it is the Prince of Darkness, in the Egyptian, it'd be Set, who steals away the severed phallus. So at night, the goddess Isis, wife of Osiris, gathers his parts, with the exception of that. So she places the obelisk to mark the severed part. Then she mounts him, becomes pregnant. So this little story about this death and reconception and then giving birth to the son again, well, this is the cycle, and it begins again and again every day. This is the meaning of the steeples on the church. Again, Osiris is the original vegetation god, god of the earth. This is an allegory that you even see in the modern Prometheus, in the Frankenstein book by Shelley, where you have a scientist who thinks he's discovered the secret of life. And so what he does is he goes to a graveyard and he takes body parts until he builds this person out of all these spare parts, sews them together. Already it sounds like the myth of Osiris being reassembled. Then he puts it on the table. He puts the body together and he hooks him up to the machine and he pulls the lever. And so you have outside the tower with the rod on top, the lightning rod, which brings down the energy from above, the electricity from the night sky, charges the dead inanimate matter of the green-faced Frankenstein monster and brings him to life. So this is the central story. And it has to do with the secret of life itself and reincarnation. And what does reincarnation really mean? Well, incarnation is like in the flesh, re-entering the flesh. So what we see here is this idea that life is a matter of dead matter or inanimate matter being animated by this force that comes from above, or the union between above and below. And this is the central rite of Christianity, of paganism, witchcraft, and of this new age space religion. So at night, when Osiris is dead, well, he's the underworld god now. Now he's the Saturnian aspect, or the death aspect, just as Christ went to hell in the Apocrypha, and then he's reborn. So you have this god of death and resurrection. And, just as a seed is planted in the ground, it's all more or less allegorical, but this is something that every Freemason would know about, because in their ceremonies, they all go through this symbolic death and resurrection. For them, the character's name is Hiram, but it's the same essential story. When Freemasons die, you'll often see they have obelisks placed on their graves. So here's some examples of some Masonic ceremony, cemeteries. And that is what it means. That is the shaft of Baal. That's what obelisk comes from. Baal is a word for Lord. So it's a ubiquitous symbol. We've all seen it. And there's a continuity here between this and the modern symbol of the rocket. So at the Washington Monument, on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo lunar mission, they projected the Saturn V rocket onto it. The Washington Monument became a rocket for the Apollo 11 anniversary. This is from the Washington Post. And the reason why this is significant is that, one, it commemorated that event, which is a very highly symbolic event. But two, it shows you that there is a continuity here. And as you can see here, you have Saturn. Now, Saturn and Osiris are the same essential character, the god of the earth, harvest, the god of death. It's the sun god's death aspect, because he has various aspects. It's not a static figure. But they projected it onto the side of the obelisk. And of course, the public may not know the precise reason for it and the symbolism, but we'll get into it more later too. But there's other occult rituals that take place in front of this obelisk every year. There's this thing called catharsis at the mall, or catharsis on the mall, where they actually have a statue of a man burned in front of the obelisk. And their symbol is a flame with the obelisk with the fires next to it. Now, the people there may not know what they're taking a part in. They may not know what the symbolism means. If you look here, you have Isis, a 45-foot tall statue of Isis, overlooking the Burning Man, and of course the obelisk. Now, earlier this year, in front of the Washington Monument, it was actually in front of the White House, but the monument could be seen in the background, there was a man on the ellipse who set himself on fire. A 33-year-old man set himself on fire right before this event, right before this catharsis event. And many believed it was staged, myself included. So man sets himself on fire at the White House. Turns out he was, and this is very significant, and we'll get into the significance here. Turns out he was 33 years old, and he did it just after the 33rd anniversary of the last time someone set themselves on fire in front of the White House. A man set himself on fire on the ellipse in downtown Washington across from the White House. Of course, this was recorded by TMZ. The ellipse is a 52-acre park that lies south of the White House and north of the National Mall. Now, the symbolism here ties into the dying and resurrecting God. It ties into the phoenix, and we'll get into all of that. Even the guy's age, 33, being the age of Christ, or the age Christ was said to be, ties into the symbolism here. Okay, so basically the astrotheological interpretations for the cycles of life and death occur with every regular rocket launch. It's a thinly disguised phallus, generally named for a sun god, blasting off into space. The erection of the rocket is a tribute to their god. Helium is pumped into the rocket right before they lift off. Helium. Now, it's a purging gas, but the reason why it's significant is Helios is another name of the sun god. You know, you're heliocentric if you're a believer in today's system. It's still the same old sun worship. You know, we all basically pay homage to Osiris, you know, every time you watch one of these things launch up. So the rocket penetrates the dome of the sky, or the goddess, and deposits its payload into space. You can look at the schematics of a launch. So for example, with SpaceX, And they use certain terminology, which is rather interesting. They do call it a payload, but the idea is that it goes into space and it deposits something into the womb of the goddess. That's what it means. It's the capsule of the rocket with the human cargo symbolizes the golden tip of Osiris's obelisk, or the royal bloodline. And we'll get into that as well. So if you look at the capsule itself, here's your SpaceX capsule. This represents the tip of the obelisk, and the tip of the obelisk is generally made of gold or some other precious stone. And it symbolizes, of course, the pharaohic elite, the blue bloods. With blue origin, well, blue origin, it's pretty clear. It's got a blue feather on it. It's the royal bloodline, or blue bloods. The astronaut symbolizes the holy seed, like the bloodline of Christ. This idea of there being like a royal bloodline. So Jeff Bezos's rocket company is really a shout out to the blue blood elite class and their ancient cult. In fact, his rocket, New Shepard, is a blatantly phallic rocket, the New Shepard. And what's more, Horus was called the Shepherd. And of course, he's the new shepherd because he's brand new, he's reborn. So here you have Jeff Bezos in front of his capsule giving a talk, about the plan to go to space. And one of his big pushes here is that we can save the world, but we're going to have to make it sustainable. In other words, we have to clamp down on freedom. So you can save the world, but that's got to change. If you want freedom and liberty, you have to go to space. But this here, of course, we're looking at the capsule. It's the same symbol. We're talking about symbolism and iconography here. As this, the top of the obelisk. You see the golden tip of the obelisk, and these are the ones who are going to be saved. The only ones who are going to escape the world, who are going to be saved from the world, are the ones who conform to the cult of the obelisk. It's the bottom line. I am the way. They hold the keys, to heaven. But the name New Shepherd ties into Horus the falcon, the falcon-headed sun god. Now, so let's move on. When we see the world-destroying missiles of the bad guy, so you have North Korea with his threats, and they have these exact same symbols. Is it any different? Well, if you look closely at these things, you'll see that they are not only very similar to the things we see by the space agencies in the terms of how they launch, but they're serving the same function symbolically. So the cult of the obelisk doesn't really care if you're worshiping voluntarily at a church, or if you're an atheist and you're worshiping by participating in the space program and that space utopianism, or if you're just someone who's generally afraid of getting nuked, doing ducking and cover drills. A duck and cover drill, because of one of these, is you bowing before an obelisk, which is ultimately a mask for state power. That's what it ultimately symbolizes, state power. It's their religion. So you're genuflecting before an obelisk. I mean, it's pretty blatant what the symbolism is here. Now, the way that they parade them around, it's like to scare you or to impress you, to intimidate you. It's a show of force. But this is actually called the Phallica in ancient Greece, the phallic processions. And these were a common feature in the celebrations of Dionysus. He's another iteration of the vegetation deity, a wine god. The phallic processions where, and you saw this even with Saturn, they make a big deal about moving this thing around, transporting it. Here we go. In ancient Greece, these were a common feature. They were advanced to the cult center, and they were characterized by a display of a fetishized phallus. Now, it is interesting, too, that Dionysus is the god of theater. Dionysus, another wine god, another god who has a similar ordeal with the death and resurrection. And of course, the water into wine originates with this god of festivities. Here he is, a wine god. So with the space religion of today, we're promised a technologically advanced paradise, a space utopia as a multi-planetary species. And of course, when we don't have progress, when we don't get there as fast as we think we should, they can always blame you, the taxpayer, because you haven't given enough money, or they don't have enough unified belief behind it. We all have to want to go green. We all have to choose this. So again, rocket or obelisk, you can clearly see what we're looking at here is just another symbol like the satellite, like Noah's Ark, like the concepts of sin. These things are all being brought back. So now let's bring up Sophia. Again, this is just another example of the new religion, and this is a new form of idolatry. So Sophia is an artificial intelligence, or supposed to be an example of artificial intelligence. She's basically a robot who's eventually going to become sentient. So this is not a coincidence that Sophia is also the name for the Gnostic goddess of wisdom. So what she does is she stands out at the UN or wherever she is put out in front of people, and she explains what she thinks we need to do to save the world. And we're supposed to trust her, or listen to her at least, because unlike human beings who have passions, political agendas, we have various motivations, we're very biased. She's not. She's considered to be more or less pure of intent. And my contention here is that what she represents is not only the goddess of wisdom, but an oracle where she can say things that if a human said the same things, they would be rejected more openly. So what they've done is they brought out this oracle that you can't question. But they also brought her out as Sophia, of course, which is this ancient goddess of wisdom. And the idea of artificial intelligence coming along and telling us what to do. That's what's next. And it has to do with the idea that since flesh is biased, since our egos cause us to sacrifice truth for emotionally fulfilling answers, and we're always willing to compromise on truth if it can satisfy some selfish need, we have to take ego out of it. So here you have Sophia the robot who's being introduced as egoless, as a pure vessel, which of course is not true. But this old animatronic is being posited as a higher mind, more or less. And higher, again, because it's above the world. And that's kind of how they've always framed it. The world is low, the flesh is low, the spirit goes high, the spirit is elevated. So the idea that she's actually higher than us is kind of implied here. Like she doesn't have any sort of mammalian tendencies. No, she's just a pure vessel, and she's going to give us answers that are objective. Yet the first thing she does is she comes out and she reinforces the dominant paradigm that the world's going to be destroyed. We need to make radical changes. So now you have this robot telling you that original sin is real and we need salvation. Again, the idea here is that flesh is tainted, that flesh is somehow fallen, and that it needs to be redeemed. So now there's this movie called The Beyond, which came out a little bit over a year ago. Came out in 2018. And this movie explains pretty clearly where this space utopianism is leading us. And what happens is the world is in crisis, as it is today, because of course science fiction is always more or less there to just prepare you for what the fake news is going to bring you or what the scientists are going to bring you. It's to open your mind up to concepts that are very anti-scientific and mystical and make you conflate it with science. So here you have this movie called The Beyond. And what happens is a new planet shows up. Looks just like Earth, and so they're calling it Earth 2. But they decided that they don't want to ruin Earth 2 like we've ruined Earth 1. So you're not allowed to go to the new planet unless you're willing to give up your body. They don't want any carbon footprints. So what you do if you want to go up to this new world is you have your brain removed and put into a robot. There's actually a brain transplant operation, after which you are now living in a robot body, which is superior to your human body in every way, and it's green. It doesn't leave any messes behind. And once you get into that, then you can go to Earth 2.0. Again, the idea here, and this is what they have constantly done, is they have constantly reinforced the idea that flesh is bad, spirit is good, and the people who've gone into space have the overview effect and they're living green. Then more recently, the high priesthood have let us in on this. They can actually print human organs in space using a 3D printer. The trouble is with printing 3D, printing organs out of a 3D printer is gravity is kind of rough on it. And so they need a machine that can print organs.
I'm European.
Here we go. But they're so refined, you can't really do it on Earth. Like you really couldn't print organs on Earth, at least not right now with our technology, but they said in outer space you can because it's 0G. So here you have this idea that even though if on Earth you need a new organ, you got to get a transplant. It's a zero-sum game. For you to gain an extra part, someone else has to lose one. In outer space, it's infinitely abundant. You need a new liver, go to space. But again, the idea here is, yeah, we can do it. We can print new organs, but you have to go to heaven. Again, that's why, this idea of outer space as heaven also includes everything that the old heavens have always promised. So, for example, in heaven you live forever. In heaven you don't have any guns, no war, no conflict. And we'll get into this, but when it comes to the technocrats and Mars, in fact, we'll get into that next. You'll see that the Martian way of life is very much designed to be sustainable. And this concept of sustainability is the idea that you could have an enclosed system that goes forever. And this is, of course, synonymous with heaven and eternity. Okay, will human organs that are 3D printed in outer space function? NASA and TechShot are printing 3D organs in space. They can print tissues in microgravity. So the tissues cannot form cohesively on a cellular level down here on Earth. Again, that just reinforces the idea that the flesh is corrupt, that the world is fallen, and you have to ascend above it to have a spiritualized body, to have your body replaced. Or this is what they do with the story of the rapture. When you go to outer space, when you're raptured, you're given a new light body, a Christ body, where you can come back down and live for 1,000 years and rebuild. So you have this new 3D printer to create human tissue in space. Here, cutting-edge biomanufacturing.
Biomanufacturing aboard the International Space Station.
So then my question is this: if the space station is fake, if they're not really in space, then what is this? Well, this is the priesthood selling you on the miraculous. Now you're supposed to believe that you could have a heart created in low Earth orbit.
Today, organ transplants from donors are prone to rejection because the patient's body perceives the new organ as a foreign object, and their immune system tries to attack it. But with the ability to grow tissue in space, a person could conceivably have their own cells used to make their new organ, which might avoid the body's rejection. 3 different types of biomanufacturing facilities will be tested aboard the space station. 2 of them perform in a manner similar to a standard 3D printer. They extrude cells in layers to build tissue. The third type uses powerful magnets to position the cell.
So again, miracles. That's my main point here. These are miracles that can only be performed in outer space, and they can only be performed outside of the gravitational pull. And of course, the idea of ascending above gravity, becoming an astronaut, these are your ascended masters. Okay, so the next part I want to move into with this space utopianism is, of course, the new Martian age and where it's headed, and of course, who's leading it. And so I was talking about Falcon 9 and Horus, the falcon god, the sun god of Mars in the Egyptian pantheon, and how this is who is venerated across the New Age movement. Many New Agers may not know it unless they're initiated into some of these groups that go deeper into the meaning behind the rites. You know, even Wiccans may not know that their religious system is quasi-Masonic, created by a Mason. In fact, streamlined mainstream version of Wicca used to contain 3 degrees of initiation, just like the Freemasons, which we will get into. I'm going to pause for about a 10-minute break here. The next part we're into here is Elon Musk. And this is also man as savior, not just Elon, but Jeff Bezos, NASA. He just happens to be one of the more visible faces. So here's the plan, which I see as the real agenda here when it comes to the idea behind the New Age. You know, it's not just about getting people to believe kooky things. It's part of an entire worldview, which includes this utopian view. So the wrath of globe is being used to coerce people into communism. And we see that even today, where these major catastrophes, these fires in California, these fires in Australia, are being blamed on climate change, which is an indirect way of saying your freedom, your free market, your activity is just so devastating to the planet that in order to save it from the wrath of globe, we're going to have to conform. Just like the idea of the futurism introduced by the Jesuits was to save the world from the wrath of God, we all have to conform. So it's about conformity and rewarding conformity to a regimented worldview. So Musk to be the dictator on Mars. Now this is based on a couple of things. First of all, Elon Musk is leading the way there to the Mars. He's the one leading the project, Mars 2020. But interestingly enough, the idea of creating a base on Mars is as old as science fiction. So I want to draw your attention to this, the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. So this was a trilogy, Foundation, Foundation Empire, Second Foundation. And it asks the questions about, you know, what happens if you start somewhere else, a new planet, if you're the founder, you know, you have a lot of questions to ask. What do you leave behind? What kind of culture are you going to have for the future? So in other words, you're more or less going to be given a great deal of power to shape what follows. So that's ultimately what this is about, the Foundation series. And the reason why this is significant is we're talking about the new founders for this new age, where we're transitioning into multi-planetary, according to these utopians. And we're going to have to go according to, well, their rules. So if they say no guns in space, no meat in space, if they say, no private property in space because it's not green, well, then that's the way it's going to have to be. And that's already been discussed. So, for example, at South by Southwest, Elon Musk was actually talking about the form of government they would have on Mars, and he said direct democracy. The idea of what we have now, the type of freedom we have now, being sustainable on Mars is already been ruled out. Like, we can't repeat the same mistakes on Earth, just like in that Netflix TV show I mentioned earlier about this new Earth that you could go to if you're willing to relinquish your body and transplant your brain into a robot. It's the same thing. You've got to give things up to go up there. So Musk is here to sell you on this utopian vision. Well, the very first time that this vision was like really well articulated, it was the Mars Project. And so the Mars Project, written by Wernher von Braun, described life on Mars as a new form of papacy with lifetime appointees. And he described the type of dictatorship that it would necessitate. And coincidentally, which I don't believe is a coincidence at all, the first dictator, of course, is called the Elon, or the Elon, which may have some significance here. When you get into the verbiage they use, the symbolism, El, elevated, the Elohim, those who came from above, the idea of the elevated ones being risen above, the overview effect. So, of course, Elon makes sense in that term, in that sense, to use that name. And really quick, I want to draw your attention to the Space Needle. We're talking about the New Age. So the symbol of the obelisk being repurposed into a rocket is something we discussed. Well, they've also repurposed the obelisk into the Space Needle, which is the same thing. Space is heaven. The obelisk is a Space Needle. The steeple is a Space Needle. It's the same symbol. But what makes this one different is that this was created for the space age. And if you look into the history of it and the architect, that is their clear intention. Their intention was a symbol for the space age, and it is a UFO, and that is a tractor beam. That is how you get elevated to heaven when you're saved. If you're, the idea of salvation from aliens and that the true believers will be beamed up and the rest will be wiped out, same old story. Same story as the rapture, repackaged for the sci-fi age. And of course, it uses the elevator, and again, the term El, E-L, Elohim, those who came from above. Well, if you see a flying saucer coming from above, what does it look like? Light, the shining ones, angel, messengers. El means light or shining ones. So what we're talking about here is, of course, the space age is about this revelation from above, and it being this new paradigm of UFOs, flying saucers. So this is an article about Project Mars, A Technical Tale by Wernher von Braun. So von Braun was in the SS in 1933, and then in 1937 he did become a member of the Nazi Party. His aeronautic expertise helped the Nazis develop the V-2. And here's the cover of his book. He became a citizen in America in 1955 and was NASA's chief architect of the Saturn V that launched the Apollo. So in his book, he imagined a mission to Mars complete with a Martian government run by a leader with the name Elon and the colonization of Mars. So coincidence? I don't think so. What we're looking at here, I believe, is more or less the metascript. So von Braun's choice for the name Elon couldn't be related to, here we go, this modern Elon, but it comes from the Old Testament. Translates into oak or grove. Von Braun was known for belonging to a tradition of scientists who believed in a higher power, and it's said that while not espousing specific spiritual beliefs, oh, this is Elon Musk. Elon Musk said he doesn't have a religion, but he does pray before the Falcon 1 launching, says he asks for any listening entities to bless the mission. Again, another picture here of von Braun. So the idea of a mission to Mars and a thriving, self-sustaining civilization is not new. It originated in science fiction. And that's another aspect to this, where everything they're going to present you on the news, all the miracles, will be things they've prepared you for with the science fiction. Or with just the regular fiction and the regular drama, or with the action and the horror. In other words, they use the culture to prepare you for what they're going to introduce in the what's supposed to be nonfiction. So they use fiction to prepare you for nonfiction, or what they say is nonfiction. So I want to go over this really quick. There was a device that they put in the back of the Tesla Roadster that they sent to the sun, or to Mars. So it's called Starman, which you all know was a Tesla Roadster sent to Mars, or at least that's the story. But listen to this. So they had something in there called an arc, which they describe as, and it's spelled arch. It's a data crystal, and it contains all 3 books from Isaac Asimov's classic Foundation trilogy. Like, why would he send the Foundation series to Mars? It says here the ARC mission was actually inspired by Asimov's Foundation series, which envisions an Encyclopedia Galactica containing all the knowledge ever gathered by a civilization. So it's a backup of civilization, in other words. But I think it also contains this idea of the Foundation series was really about this whole new age and this emergence of an age of Mars colonization, becoming multi-planetary. But it's more than just a tribute to science fiction that he has the arc to Mars with these science fiction books in there, because the Mars mission is the ark. It is Noah's Ark. So Noah's Ark was for the elevated, the ones who were chosen to be saved. Well, the ones who are going to be elevated today are the ones who get up in the rocket, which is the ark of today. And of course, the foundation is that the founders of this new world are going to be the technocrats, and they decide what you believe, what you think. It's a totally enclosed system. So I want to draw your attention to this. This is called Wall-E. It's a Pixar. It's a Disney film. And what you're looking at is this robot called Wall-E, who's left behind on Earth to pick up all the trash. Because the world has been covered in trash, so the human race has left. So this lonely robot is collecting the junk, packaging it, boxing it, and when his task is complete, or nearly complete, he meets this other robot who comes down from above. Her name is Eve. So Eve is looking around the world for something, and he gets to know her, and Eve is actually looking for signs of life. And she finds a little plant, like a little tiny plant, just one. So what she does is she then takes this plant and she goes back up to space, and Wally's down here on Earth, like, what is this creature doing? What is this? He doesn't understand what she's doing. Well, turns out the human race left the Earth because it was so covered in trash, they couldn't live anymore. And the planet itself, as you see in the very beginning of the movie, is surrounded by space junk. So it's not even getting any sun. I mean, it's just a total wreck. And of course, it's the humans that did it. And the movie is just disparaging of humans the entire time. I mean, it's the human race has just ruined everything, and we had to leave. Well, so now the humans are living inside of this massive ship that's surrounding the Earth. And they live in this state of total luxury where they don't even have to move because they're in zero G and they're sitting in recliners and they have a screen in front of them. They're fed through tubes and their robot servants take care of all their needs. So here you have these fat people in this big ship orbiting the Earth, waiting until there's signs of life. So it turns out that the captain of the ship sent down this little white robot to find the life. Hey, can we go back down to Earth yet? So she goes down, she meets Wall-E, she sees all the trash, she finds a branch or a plant, and she takes it back up to the ship, to the humans. And they say, okay, well, there's land, we can go back. So there again, you have the story of Noah's Ark and how the people have to wait on the ark until it's safe to go back. And the sign, of course, is a branch held in the mouth of a dove. In this case, it's a branch held by a white winged robot. Now here you have an image of the humans in space. They're all just bloated, they're weak now, and they're not used to living on Earth's gravity. So when they go back down, it's very difficult at first. The transition from this comfort to living on Earth again sustainably is difficult. So in this movie, the human beings go back down to Earth and they realize, hey, we can't pollute it again. Look what happened before. So what do? Well, this time they're going to listen to Noah. This time they're not going to pollute it, and they become communists. They give up their technology, and here's Wall-E holding the branch. They give up their technology, they give up their capitalism, they give up their private property and their luxury, and they become farmers. And of course, this represents the dove in the story of Noah. And of course, the robots who serve the humans represent the underclass, the poor, or the people in other countries, the cheap labor, who enable the capitalists to get so fat and lazy and to destroy the world with their wickedness. And them being fat and weak and in this this state of that they're in is meant to show that, hey, look, they've been utterly debased by sin or error, pollution. They've been corrupted. Okay, so there we go. That's just Wall-E, and this is programming for the kids. So they're getting both a political agenda here, you know, communism, statism. They're getting a religious agenda as well, Noah's Ark, and this story of what happens if you disobey. And of course, it's all brought under the guise of, you know, Disney entertainment for kids. So let's move on. They want everyone to know this. And so this is what I've been saying. The concept of this Martian project, or going to Mars, is that the wrath of globe is going to move us out of here. We're going to have to go somewhere else, and communism is the answer. So I think the grand picture is essentially no different than the Gulag system. A bunch of farmers, conformists, living sustainably. So then, of course, you have Musk as the dictator on Mars. The government's based on Rome's organizational structure, which is what Werner von Braun said. Now, he was a Nazi rocket scientist and a Vatican agent. So this means, too, that Musk is a world savior. And this is why I call him Pope Musk. You know, the Pope represents the vicar of Christ, meaning the embodiment of Christ. That's what the seat means. You know, the Pope is an avatar. So in many ways, Elon Musk with the Falcon mission, and that he's got the Obelisk behind him, he's the world savior, he's the avatar of Mars, as much as the Pope is the avatar of Apollo or Osiris. So let's go ahead and get into this really briefly here. I'll get more detailed into it here in a minute when we get into the Thelema. But the way that the occultists describe it is that we are in the age of Horus. We just transitioned out of the age of Osiris, and this is from the teachings of Thelema. And I'll get into this soon, but essentially, there's this idea that